Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, I interview BPC Senior Advisor Theresa and Associate Director within BPC's Economic Policy Program, Emerson Sprick, on their new report, Has Congress Given Up on Bipartisan Immigration Reform? A data-driven look at legislation since 2015. The report challenges the narrative that Congress has abandoned bipartisan immigration reform by analyzing hundreds of immigration-related bills introduced with bipartisan support since the 114th Congress. We explore where bipartisan interest has been strongest, which bills become law, and what the findings mean for lawmakers and advocates today. So stay tuned. Conventional wisdom holds that Congress has abandoned bipartisan immigration reform since the Gang of Eight's failed effort to overhaul the immigration system during the 113th Congress. The legislative record, however, tells a somewhat different story. Last month, the Bipartisan Policy Center released a report analyzing immigration-related bills introduced on a bipartisan basis since the beginning of the 114th Congress to understand the degree of bipartisan interest, bipartisan focus areas, and key takeaways for lawmakers and others working on immigration policy. To take us through the report, we welcome the two report authors, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa and Associate Director within BPC's Economic Policy Program, Emerson Sprick. So welcome to the podcast, both.
Thanks, Jack.
Glad to be back, Jack.
Well, let's start with you, Theresa. So can you take us through what was the motivation behind writing this report, and what were you trying to achieve?
Sure. So, I think there's been a few attempts at some bipartisan legislation since the last big sort of comprehensive immigration reform bill in the Gang of Eight, which ended in 2014. And there's been a lot of lamenting that there hasn't been a lot of bipartisan efforts. But we at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we pay a special attention to bills that are introduced on a bipartisan basis. And so we were wondering, how strong is their bipartisan interest in immigration? Is it still there in Congress? There are a lot of people in the immigration advocacy world and the political punditry world who just have kind of, come to the conclusion that Congress is not able to legislate on immigration at all, really, or if so, is not going to be able to do it on a bipartisan basis. The parties are just too far apart. And that didn't resonate with those of us who've been kind of looking at the bipartisan space for the last 10 years. And in particular, we have talked to members of Congress and we have worked with offices who have been interested in bipartisan immigration reform. Some of them have been public, some of them have not been that public, but we just wanted to kind of, let's look at the data and what does it say? More importantly, we wanted to kind of learn, immigration covers a whole lot of stuff. We know that Democrats tend to talk a lot about legalization efforts and protecting refugees and asylum seekers, and Republicans talk a lot about immigration enforcement and the border. But we wanted to see where are the areas where there is more bipartisanship. What are the parts of immigration where the parties have more opportunity to get together? And we had theories about this. We actually had done some polling early in the 2010s that seemed to indicate that legal immigration reforms were an area that the parties might come together on, but we didn't have evidence whether that was actually true in the legislative setting. So that was the impetus behind the report.
Great. And Emerson, can you take us through the analytical approach you took?
Sure. So in total, during the study period, which was the 114th Congress, which began in 2015, through the 118th Congress, which just ended at the end of 2024, 67,000 bills almost were introduced in total. So first, we had to narrow that down to immigration bills, right? And that excluded quite a few. So immigration bills over that 10-year period totaled 2,847 separate pieces of legislation. To narrow it down further, we, as Theresa mentioned, focused on the bills that were introduced on a bipartisan basis. So for us, we took kind of the simplest approach to that and required the bills in our sample to have at least one co-sponsor from both of the major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. From there, we excluded a few other bills that weren't related directly to the immigration system, but were still classified in our search tool as being related to immigration. These are things like bills related to border security, bills related to, criminal justice within the United States, but focused on immigrants, things like drug interdiction. We wanted to really focus this analysis on, I guess, the legal pathways that immigrants take rather than the physical pathways they take and what happens once they have already immigrated. So that got us down to 309 immigration bills introduced over that 10-year study period from the 114th through the 118th Congresses on a bipartisan basis. And we went from there, looking at different patterns and trends within those 309 bills.
Okay, great. So let's move to the actual findings. So, Theresa, firstly, is the conventional wisdom that Congress has abandoned bipartisan immigration reform a valid one?
So no, clearly the fact that we found 309 bipartisan bills that were aiming to change the immigration system, that means editing immigration law, shows there is still interest. And one of the things we noted is how many bills were introduced in each Congress. And we actually saw an increase in the number of bipartisan bills in the last two Congresses, 117th and 118th. So it actually showed a little bit of increase in the interest in introducing bipartisan legislation, which was interesting. We saw some bills had, just a couple of co-sponsors, and others had, dozens of co-sponsors. So there's a wide variety of what bipartisanship is here. And we did break down, which bills had the highest number of sponsors, the most number of members in the House or the Senate who co-sponsored it on a bipartisan basis as an indication of the importance of that issue or the salience of that issue to members. We looked at which bills had the most even numbers of Republicans and Democrats. So we weren't necessarily, if there was, mostly people from one side and a few from the other side, that's not as bipartisan. It is still bipartisan. We counted it, but it's not as bipartisan as bills that had closer to a 50-50 ratio, for example. And we do know that some members actually try to keep it at a 50-50 ratio when they are interested in pushing an immigration bill that is bipartisan. They do something called, Noah's Arking, which is, they don't allow somebody to co-sponsor the bill unless they bring somebody from the other party. So you have to go 2 by 2. That may reduce the overall number of people who might be interested in sponsoring it, but that shows that member who introduced the bill is very much interested in maintaining the bipartisan nature of the bill. So there are bills that do that. We looked at, did the bills ease immigration or restrict immigration? Obviously, there were bills that did both. We found the preponderance of the bipartisan bills were bills that eased immigration in some way, either opening up new avenues of immigration, lifting numbers or caps, or in some other way allowing more people to come or stay legally in the United States. And last but not least, of those categories that we looked at, employment-based immigration, bills that allowed people to work in the United States were the largest group of bills introduced on a bipartisan basis. So all of these we found were very important and relevant findings, particularly in this period of time, and also particularly as we think about what are the potential avenues for future bipartisan immigration reform.
And Emerson, are there any other insights into where the most bipartisan interest was?
Yeah, well, as Theresa said, the largest number of bills was related to employment-based immigration, and this is both immigrant and non-immigrant visas for both temporary and permanent workers, right? And the majority of these bills, as Theresa alluded to, would have eased restrictions on employment-based immigration. And this is really important and relates to another recent report that I know the two of you published, as lawmakers look for ways to fill really important workforce shortages. So one of the key pieces of legislation that was reintroduced time after time in various forms was related to the Conrad 30 waiver program. So this is the program that allows medical doctors who came to the United States on J-1 exchange visitor visas to not have to return to their home country before getting a work visa here in the United States. It's been really important at helping to ameliorate some of the labor force shortages in the medical field. There was other legislation, focused on expanding opportunities for nursing visas, right? And even beyond that, Looking at more the temporary workforce, there was a large body of legislation introduced during the study period on a bipartisan basis that in various ways would have expanded the H-2A and H-2B kind of temporary workforce visa programs. So the labor force shortages the United States is experiencing and shoring up the workforce was a key motivating factor for legislators throughout this study period. But we also found that there was a lot of legislation just related to changes to the lawful permanent residency and naturalization and citizenship process. A lot of those bills related to easing that process for immigrants who served in the military. Relatedly, there was a lot of legislation, particularly during the time when the United States Armed Forces were in the process of withdrawing from Afghanistan. It related to expanding special immigrant visas for foreign nationals who provide, immense service to the U.S. Armed Forces abroad. And there was a lot of legislation related to not border security, but restrictions on entrance into the United States and deportations. And, despite that kind of section heading, a lot of those bills, too, were focused on easing those restrictions, right, rather than just increasing them. So we saw, a lot of focus on these kind of very important and in many cases timely categories with, as Theresa said, the preponderance of the focus being on easing those restrictions on immigrants and immigration in various ways.
Yeah, and it's great to see the bipartisan interest in the healthcare workforce, because that was a key area that our previous report highlighted as being at risk of shortage going forward.
Yeah, it's worth noting that our study period did cover the COVID era, right, at 2020 to 2024, I guess you could call it officially. And a lot of those healthcare workforce bills on immigration we saw and we talked about on the podcast were during that time when the acute need for medical workforce was felt across the country as medical hospitals and other medical facilities were dealing with the large number of patients through COVID. So, some of the bills like the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act were introduced tied to the COVID emergency, but we've seen bills like that reintroduced post-COVID emergency, recognizing that we still have some projected and current shortages in some of those medical occupations. So I think it's still, as you mentioned, it is still a significant area of interest and bipartisan interest.
Okay, great. Well, let's take a quick break, but when we come back, more from Theresa and Emerson on the report. Okay, welcome back. So, Theresa, while there has been this significant bipartisan interest, the report does find that actually quite a small number of bills actually become law. So what were the findings around legislation actually being enacted?
So I think anybody who's been in immigration for a while does know that Congress has found it hard to actually enact immigration law. It is much easier to introduce bills than it is to see them enacted. That's true of every piece of legislation. But in the immigration space, as Emerson mentioned, of these bipartisan bills, only 5% of them actually got enacted. Some were enacted on their own. Some were enacted as part of omnibus bills, whether that's appropriations bills or like the National Defense Authorization Act or other omnibuses. And most of those bills that were enacted were more narrowly focused. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But it's not zero, right? So there were actually bipartisan immigration bills that were enacted into law. And I think there's a lot of people who that even that much might be a surprise to them that they actually did manage to enact things. And these bills were enacted when both parties were in control at different times, right? So it's not just, oh, when Democrats are in charge, they are able to enact more bills, or when Republicans are in charge, they are able to enact more bills. The bills were enacted at different times when different parties were in control. So that didn't seem to be a determining factor necessarily. Again, we're looking at bipartisan bills. This is not to say there might have been other immigration bills that were passed on a partisan basis. We did not consider those because we're focused on what can the parties work on together. And again, I think, it's worth repeating, why do we focus on this? It's not just because bipartisan is in our name. We focus on this because our belief, and it's proven by data, is that bills that are passed on a bipartisan basis have longer longevity. Like they last longer. The other party is not so quick to try to undo it. They tend to represent a broader consensus, both in Congress and among the American people, that generates that level of support that says, yes, this is something we want to do and we should do. And even though it's harder sometimes to pass bipartisan legislation, we're talking in the middle of the Republicans trying to do reconciliation, which is a party line effort. It does tend to represent those areas where there is existing agreement and where a lot of times these are important areas for their constituents, for their country, for the country that they engage in. So even though it's a small number that actually were enacted, we still think that it is far preferable for immigration or frankly any legislation that is going to be enacted to be done so on a bipartisan basis.
Yeah, we still see a very small proportion becoming law. And did the report sort of uncover any insights into why that's the case?
Well, I think one of the things that we saw is that the bigger the bill, the harder it is. If it's trying to cover a lot of different areas, even though it might be primarily focused on employment-based immigration, say, a bill like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act includes enforcement mechanism. It includes a legalization provision. It includes changes to the temporary worker program. It includes green cards, right? It includes a lot of different aspects of the immigration system, even though it's focused just on farm workers. And that's a pretty broad bill, and that has not been enacted. So, bills that were focused on a particular area that seemed discrete in some way tended to have more success. Bills that tried to do a lot more had a harder time. And some of these bills might have flown beneath the radar for most people. They weren't top of headline news. And, that also maybe helped by flying under the radar, members could, pursue this in kind of quietude without a lot of external, noise making a big deal about it. Because we do know that still politically, for many members, any immigration vote could be, a risk. And so, those kind of things, I think, represented some commonalities among the bills that we saw enacted.
That's right. And I can chime in and kind of fill in the blanks on what some of those pieces of legislation did. So, as Theresa said, it was 5% of the bills in our sample that were passed. That represents 15 pieces of legislation, but some of those had to be reintroduced multiple times before they were ultimately passed. And so it represents kind of 9 separate bills, right? All but 2 eased restrictions on immigration, which I think, aligns well with the findings from the rest of this report. But these bills, like Theresa said, are very narrowly focused. And I think that's one of the main takeaways from this paper. So a lot of them had to do with those special immigrant visas for particularly Afghan immigrants who provided support and assistance to the U.S. Armed Forces. There was a bill that was passed called the Adoptive Family Relief Act, which, specifically allowed immigrant visa fees to be waived or refunded for adopted children under certain situations, making international adoptions easier for U.S. Citizens. There was a bill that expanded limitations on the visa waiver program that we have in the U.S. that allows visitors from some countries to visit the U.S. without a visa, to more specifically take into account risks of terrorism. There was a bill that extended eligibility for what are called treaty, trader, and investor visas to citizens of New Zealand, contingent on New Zealand extending the same eligibility to U.S. citizens, right? So these are all right. They're all substantive steps forward for the immigration system. What they don't represent is a massive omnibus comprehensive immigration reform. And so, like Theresa said, I think there are really important lessons from that for lawmakers who are looking to take steps in the right direction.
Yeah. One last caveat that I should mention is that there have been immigration provisions that were adopted through some of these omnibus bills that weren't necessarily introduced as separate legislation previously. The ones that were, we tried to track, but sometimes things come up just like at the end of the day, you're reading through a 1,000-page bill and go, hey, wait a minute, there's a change there that didn't seem to have a predecessor piece of legislation that we could actually point to. So there may have been other changes, and a lot of omnibus bills are passed on a bipartisan basis, but those kind of provisions were not necessarily counted in our survey.
The Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act is raised in the report as something we can learn from. What would that bill have done, and what can we learn from that legislative attempt?
Right. So we've talked about the Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act on this podcast before, and its successor, the EAGLE Act. There was a huge push, a bipartisan push in Congress during the study period to try to reduce or eliminate the backlogs that certain countries face in employment-based immigrant visas. And Jack, you wrote a report on the economic costs of some of these backlogs. But in the employment-based visa system, because of per country caps, which mean that only 7% of all immigrant visas in any given year can go to any single country, people who come from countries that have a large number of people waiting for green cards have a longer wait. And in the employment-based immigration category, the two countries with the longest wait are India and China, with India far outpacing China, like decades of waiting for an employment-based green card. And this is across most of the more common employment-based immigrant visa categories. So what the Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act would have done initially was eliminate the per country caps for employment-based immigration. Another version of it increased the per country caps from 7% to say 15% on family-based and employment-based immigration. Over the different years that it was introduced, other provisions were attached. And some of this was because people from other countries than China and India felt that if an increased number of visas each year were given to them and the overall caps were not increased, which the bill did not propose to do, then it would mean longer waits for people from other parts of the world. So one of the constituent groups that was concerned about this were the people that work with and for immigrant nurses. So right now, we don't have a temporary visa category that allows foreign nurses to come in and work. The only way they can come in is on a green card through an employment-based green card. And as of, the time that most of these bills were introduced, the Philippines was the country where the largest number of these nurses came from, and they did not have a wait. And so obviously advocates for foreign nurses working in the United States said, hey, wait a minute, these are, as we just spoke about, these are very critical employees, particularly during the time of COVID. We do not want to see any lengthening of the time it takes us to get them in. Can you put in a carve out that allows us to keep getting our visas? And so the sponsors of the bill eventually did that. Well, then other organizations said, well, wait a minute, you're still pulling back visas from other parts of the world. And this seems unfair. It would disproportionately help these two countries. And so, but a lot of them come on H-1Bs. So while we're doing this, can we fix the H-1B program? So over the years that this bill iterated, and it did have some votes in the House and on the Senate, more and more of these kind of provisions were added to the bill to try to say, okay, you've identified a problem. Let's see if we can fix it. And will you get on board? And it grew the bill. It started addressing more and more things. And some of the things that they added actually caused other supporters of the bill to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure I like that thing you added, right? So as it got bigger, it didn't necessarily increase the support for the bill. Even people who, they were trying to kind of mitigate the negative impact on their constituents were like, yeah, at the end of the day, I don't know that this is still the right answer. And as I mentioned, in the last Congress, it was reintroduced as the EAGLE Act, but it didn't move. And we haven't seen a reintroduction of this in this current Congress as of yet. So this issue is one that continues, obviously. There is still a backlog for these cases. There are still people waiting decades, and there's still bipartisan interest in figuring out how to deal with it. But I think this is one of those things where the solutions may cause more issues, right? It's hard to be narrowly focused if what you're proposing has impacts on other groups that are negative, right? So even though it started as a narrow bill, it kept growing to try to address the negative impact on other groups, and that diluted some of its support. And it ended up pitting some immigrant groups against others, and I think it became kind of messy, honestly. But that's one of the lessons that we took away, which is at least in the current time frame, even if you think you're trying to do something narrow, it's important to understand, are there other impacts of this narrow thing on other parts of the system that you're going to have to be aware of? Because if it does impact other things, that may create more problems in seeing progress on the bill.
So narrowness is not going to guarantee success. You do have to look at all these impacts. And okay, so we've discussed quite a few takeaways for lawmakers. Some of the key themes coming out, these big, complicated bills where things are added, they tend to have less success. And maybe the way to go is these more targeted pieces of legislation. But yeah, let's start with Emerson. What do you think are some of the key takeaways for lawmakers?
The other thing I would highlight is I think this report shows how important it is for lawmakers to not resign themselves to a world of immigration policy whiplash by executive order, right? There are paths toward legislative success on immigration reform, and it might sound like over the study period, very little immigration has been passed. But honestly, I think if you compared it to any other category, a 5% success rate is probably not too far outside the norm. So I just think it's really important for lawmakers to take responsibility for making immigration laws. And like I said, not resign themselves to immigration policy being dictated by the executive branch. And I think that there are really strong pathways for members of Congress to do that.
Yeah, I can actually provide a particular example there. So President Biden, in the last year of his term, issued an executive order that tried to provide a pathway for undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens to get green cards without having to leave the country. And that program was blocked in court. But there were many iterations of a bill called American Citizens United that were introduced in Congress to try to address that same issue. And it had some bipartisan support. I wouldn't say it's highly one of the 50-50 bills, but it had some bipartisan support. So you saw members of Congress saying, okay, we understand that maybe the courts aren't going to let this be done by executive order, but we think it's important. The other thing I would say is that the high number of bills that kept getting reintroduced, Congress after Congress after Congress, that the same bill or very similar bills covering similar subjects were issued on a bipartisan basis in both the House and the Senate. And the lesson that tells me is persistence matters. There is no quick win. And we've talked about that on the podcast before. Republicans and Democrats both have tried, when they had House, Senate, and White House, to do things on party line votes and on immigration with no success. They really have not been successful in doing that. We'll see what happens with this reconciliation package. But it's worth noting that reconciliation, by its very nature, limits the policy changes you can make. You can make monetary changes, and money sometimes is policy, but other things can't be done via that mechanism and do require more of a regular legislative process. And the fact that, even 5% of bills could get enacted on a bipartisan basis, I think is worth noting. And many of these are ideas that have been around for a while. They keep coming back up because the issues haven't gone away. And in some cases, the issues have only been exacerbated. So even though we haven't seen a version of the EAGLE Act or the Fairness for Skilled Immigrants Act introduced to this Congress yet, I don't think this issue has gone away. And I fully expect that we'll see something introduced at some point, looking at per country limits and backlogs again. So it's also worth understanding, whether you are a legislator or an advocate for any position on immigration, that persistence actually does have an impact. Being able to keep moving forward with legislation, getting reintroductions, getting more co-sponsors, trying to get more people on board, because that's how people gain awareness of the issue you're trying to address. And there's more of a chance for something to work.
Okay, well, thank you both. I think we'll end things there. I will ensure that the report link is in the show notes. If anyone wants to read the full report, I would strongly recommend you do. But yeah, thanks for taking us through the report, Theresa and Emerson.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate the opportunity.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Audio editing was by Joshua Joe. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.